All right, good morning. Here we are in Contracts 101, and today we're just going to be going over contract and offer basics, going over the forms and everything. So this morning I've got Connor here on Zoom. I'll check here in a few minutes to see who might be joining us on Facebook. I don't have anybody in the classroom with me this morning, so I'm sitting today rather than standing. I'll still, I guess, try to share my screen in case anyone does pop in. So good morning, Connor, and good morning, everyone else. So let's go ahead and just get started. I tend to run out of time with this particular class. So I'm going to share my screen. Back to the right screen here. And there it is. All right, so here we are. I'm sharing, and this is my landing page on Loop. As I've said before, when you all are doing things, you should start in command and connect your loop to your command. I'm not doing it that way here, but and you can always start something in Loop and add it to command later. It's just like maybe another extra step, Brett tells me. But so I just start everything here in Loop, and once you're in command and connect the loop, then you'll be on your landing page and all of that too. So shouldn't look all that much different to you. It's just I don't start with the command step. So I'm on my landing page, and so we're going to go once again into templates. Well, on Wednesday, we will talk about preparing to write an offer. I would like to think that I could get through everything about actually writing an offer in 2 hours, but I don't. So we'll talk about preparing for all of the things that you need in order to write an offer. I've said before in this class as well that don't plan on having an offer ready in half an hour. It's going to take you much longer than that. It still takes me much longer than that to prepare everything and then also complete all of the paperwork in order to present an offer to my clients for signature, much less than on to the other agent. So plan on a couple of hours at least your first few times through. And another thing that I want to say too, again, is that I think everyone should be just a little bit nervous, have a few butterflies in your tummy when you're getting ready to do this. It is a legal document. It is binding your client to an agreement, if in fact we do have an agreement. The fact that you are just writing the offer, how you write the offer can put your client in either a good light or maybe not so good light in the presentation of that offer to the seller. The other agent is going to be grading you, judging you on what your offer looks like, and then pass along their impressions of that to their seller. They have not only do they have the right to do that, that's really their obligation to do that. Same thing with you when you are accepting one. If you receive an offer that is not well written, that is a perfect indication that the transaction may not go well. And so if you see that, then you are under the obligation to present it that way to your client, to your seller, if you're on the other side of this. There's so many things throughout the contract that a seller can make their decision based upon those things that are not necessarily just the money. how well it's written, whether it's legible. If you're handwriting one, make sure that it's legible. If you're on .loop, make sure that you've done everything correctly, which is my job. All of you should be sending all of your contracts through to me before you ever send them to your clients for signatures. If you've already sent it to your clients, then send it to me before you send it on to the other agent. Any changes that have to be made means that your client has to sign it all, initial and sign everything again. Send it to me first, and not only just the initial offer, but any amendments that you would be doing further on once you have an agreement between a buyer and a seller. Anything that comes up after that too should be something that I should be looking at. So, but getting back to the presentation of it, so make sure that everything is clearly stated. We'll get into that a little bit when we talk about the things that you can write in there, which is not very much, folks. I mean, for the most part, all we are allowed to do, since we are not licensed attorneys, is to really just to fill in blanks on approved forms. And for the most part, those are dates and timeframes and the legal descriptions and that kind of thing. But there is a place in our initial offer, in our initial contract, in which you can actually write something. We need to make sure that it's clear that you're asking for something in the proper way. We don't want to be too broad. We don't want to be too specific, but we want to be clear. And making sure that you have filled in those blanks correctly. If there's anything that is incorrect, number one, it may make your buyer just lose out on it just because of the term, because of that particular term or condition. If it's not written clearly, and what some agents might say properly, then again, that's something that the listing agent and the seller can base a decision on. And especially if you're in still one of those situations, we have lots of situations still going on right now where there's a lot of competition going on certain properties and certain price ranges in certain areas. And it may come down to just not only the way that the offer is written, but also could be certain things like the lender that's chosen, or if you're making a request that might seem a little unusual or out of the ordinary, or just something that the seller might not want to do. So we'll get into all of that, but just make sure that you're doing things properly. That's the whole point of this exercise. That's why we do this once a month. And I hope I hit on something new every time for those of you that are really good about going back and watching these or joining me. I know Connor's been on here a few times. So I hope I'm hitting something new every time. And then, as Kristen and I like to say, we try to go over your contracts and all of your paperwork in order to keep 3 people out of trouble. We need to keep your client out of trouble. That's our number one job. We need to keep you out of trouble. We need to keep the brokerage out of trouble. So that's the importance of making sure that everything's correct. It is a legal binding document. That's the disclosure that we have on the bottom, on the very last thing, on all of our documents there. And I feel very strongly that you all should keep that in mind too. So, all right, so there's that. All right, Linda's little lecture for the morning. So I'm over here in my templates. My templates are going to look different than yours, but you will have the 2023 KCRAR residential forms here. The interactive forms are everything. So anything that you need would be in there, but there are lots of things that you don't need that are in the interactive forms folder also. So the 2023 KCRAR residential forms, and we're going to start then just with the real estate contract. Everything's in alphabetical order in here. And when you get down here to the real estate sale contract, there's one for land. You don't want that one. There's one for land with calculations, one for land without calculations. Then the sales contract for new homes with calculations, new homes without calculations. You will only be using that if you are writing on new construction. And I don't typically go into that in this class because it's, one of those things I'm hoping that you all will do it. I expect you all to do that at some point in your career. It's just probably not going to be the first one that you do. Of course, there are exceptions to that. As soon as I say that, 5 of you are going to have new construction as your first one. So, that's the way that goes. But so I don't typically go over that. There are some differences in there. And actually, this is the KCRER form for new home construction. A lot of builders out there are using their own contract. And that's really, really, really when you need someone other than your eyes looking at it. There are different terminology. Things are stated differently. There are different things that they have to cover in new construction. And so always, 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 please make sure that you are sending those to me for review. The thing about that is if you are in a new construction, if you're at the site working with the listing agent, they are usually the ones that are helping you through that form, which is fine because they're the ones familiar with it. Just make sure that you run it by someone else too, just to make sure that all of the terms are at least understood. There's not a whole lot you can do about changing those forms. Builders probably wouldn't accept an offer on their contract that had written changes in it. And again, that's not anything we can do. We cannot change a legal document, but we just want to make sure that everything's clear and understood there. So here we are finally to the real estate sales contract residential, the with calculations, without calculations. The with calculations, there's just one place in which that really becomes helpful to you. But I suggest that you go ahead and choose that one. So that's the one that we're going to choose here. As we are heading into getting really close to December, anytime now, we're probably going to get the introduction of our new 2024 forms. I haven't talked with Lynn to see what might have changed and what kind of changes we might be talking about, but which is, again, why I never, ever ask any of you to memorize the forms, because any one of them can have changes. There are typically some changes to our sales contract every year. Sometimes, a lot of times it's just the way something's worded, or there's a checkbox added. So line numbers are going to change. Sometimes they slip a new paragraph in there or remove a paragraph. So the paragraph numbering may change. I do expect you to familiarize yourself with that. I think that everyone here in launch and all existing agents should be familiar enough with the contract that you can reference the paragraph number that something's that someone might have a question about. So we'll get into that a little bit later here too. So, all right. So we're really just today going to go over the forms themselves, the documents themselves, the contract here, and how we fill in certain things, where we get the information, etc. Over break, I'll try to remember to pull up the sample 2023 contract that we have, that Kristen has done for the last several years. I'm going to be doing it for the 2024 forms when the changes come out. It is perfectly okay for you to have a dummy form, the sample form, where we've written in what's supposed to go there and typically where you would find that information. So, and this is just verbally what we're going to go over here today, but you will find that sample form in either the portal, or it's also in the files section of the Facebook, the launch Facebook page. So that's readily available to you. I know there's a lot of stuff in there that we need to go through and call some things out, because there's some of the old contract samples in there as well. So make sure you're looking at the 2023. And if it were me, because I'm a paper person, I would print it out and carry that around with me all the time, and have that, even if you're filling out the form on .loop or DocuSign. I tend to stick with .loop because it's what I use, but I know there's some of you out there that might be choosing to use DocuSign instead. But have that beside you, printed out beside you as you are going through, even if you're sitting with your client doing it. And that's another thing, let me just say here too, I'll reiterate on Wednesday, but I would suggest that, especially as you are going through this the first few times and you're not very familiar with the forms, that you say to your client, hey, why don't you go, it's going to be a couple of hours before I'll get this to you. So, go get a drink, go, even if you're meeting with them in person later on, go get something to eat and we'll meet up later. Most of the time, you're probably going to be, they're going to be at home and you're going to be somewhere else doing this. So just make sure that you prepare your buyer for the fact that it's not going to be immediate. Don't expect it in the next 20 minutes. It's going to take you a while to do it. But even if you are sitting with them in person, filling out the offer contract, then it's perfectly okay for you to have the cheat sheet there. Don't ever feel bad or self-conscious about that. So, all right. And then also just to point out, I say this in my pre-exam classes, we do write our offers on the real estate sales contract. Other parts of the country do it differently, where you have an offer form basically, and then transfer things to the contract. But the way our contracts are written, if we make an offer and the seller is agreeable to all of the terms without making any changes to it, the seller signs that exact same document. So initials and signs it. So we write our offer on our sales contract. So here we go with this. On line number 4, we write the seller's name. Where do we find that information? You can find it on the tax records in MLS, or what I prefer to do is go to a document that is in MLS. I usually look at the seller's disclosure because 99% of the time there's a seller's disclosure there, or lead-based paint if the house is old enough to qualify for the lead-based paint disclosure. The property, I should say, is built before 1978. We have to have the lead-based paint disclosure there, even though we might not always have a seller's disclosure when we really should. We always will have a lead-based paint disclosure on a property built before 1978, because that is a federal requirement, and there is a heavy fine if the proper documentation is not in the file with that. And so I usually look those places. If none of that's available, then you can go to the tax records and pull it from the tax records. My concern with using the tax records is that it might have Sam and Sally Seller referenced as a married couple, not on tax records, but you might assume that. Listed as the seller's name, but in reality, it might be, in the meantime, Sam and Sally might have started a trust. And so that would be reflected on we hope, on the seller's disclosure or lead-based paint disclosure. So I usually look those places first and then use whatever is on those, because those are things that the seller and the agent have worked together, we hope, to fill out properly, and it should have their marital status on it. I would assume that Sam Seller and Sally Seller are a married couple on the tax records, but they might be siblings. So I usually try to find that information somewhere else, but if it's not available anywhere else, then I do go to the tax records and use whatever's there, and then ask about marital status. I'll talk about this again on Wednesday too, but there's a lot here that before I ever even start writing an offer, I would call the listing agent and ask certain things, but ask about, if there's no seller's disclosure, ask for one. Certainly, if there's no lead-based paint when there should be, ask for one. I always also ask why the sellers are selling the property. Even if it's in MLS, even if there's a little bit in there that might give me an indication, I still ask, because those are the kinds of questions that, and an open-ended question like that, why are the sellers leaving or selling this property? If you get a chatty Cathy agent, then you might find out all kinds of information that might help your client in your side in negotiations. You might find out that it's a distress situation. You might find out that it's not. But you would definitely might find out some things that could help your client. Even I'm not saying that, yes, if I found out it was a distressed situation, I certainly would tell my clients that we're under an obligation to tell our clients that. Not necessarily if they're a customer. If you are working with an unrepresented buyer, that's one of those things to watch out for. You can't give information necessarily like that. What we are required and limited to giving a customer, someone that we are not representing, don't have a buyer agency agreement with, we have to give them material facts, which are facts about the property itself or about the title that might change their mind about buying the property. Kind of the thumbnail definition of that. Negotiating help is something that we cannot give someone that we are not representing. Another real reason to, number one, try not to work with a buyer that you are not representing. Try to get them under buyer agency, or if they won't, or if you've chosen not to, because a lot of times, you know, I'll go show somebody a property without having a buyer agency agreement, just to see if I feel that I want to work with them. If it's someone that I don't know, most of the people that I work with are referrals, and you all will get to that point too. But I still work with people that I meet in open houses and that kind of thing, and I don't know anything about them. But by the time I'm ready to write a contract with them, I really do want to be representing them, and just for reasons like that. Okay. Long-windedness there. All right, so get the seller's information from the best source possible. Buyer's name, you should have that if you do have a buyer agency agreement with them, or even if you don't, you should have the inspection advisory or the franchise agreement addendum, or the cyber protection notice. So you should have at some point asked them what their preference is, as far as their using their full name, middle initials, suffixes, all those kinds of things, or if they're buying as a company, as an entity, other than their own names. But that's what we would use here on line number 6, and there's plenty of space there, 2 lines for both seller and buyer, in case you have multiple buyers, multiple sellers, and there plenty of space. We would check the box on line 9 if it is a bank-owned property, if it's a foreclosure property. On MLS, it's also referred to as an REO. Real estate owned is what REO stands for. So you would only check this box if it is a foreclosure. And it is, you get, it's not even clues. You are told right up front if it's foreclosure. If you're reading MLS and talking with that listing agent, then you will know whether or not it is a foreclosure. You will know that it is a foreclosure if in fact it is. Line number 14, improvements on the property include a manufactured mobile home. This is a manufactured or mobile home. This is an important thing to notice. If you are working, we don't run across this much when we're talking about suburban Kansas City, but if you're working out in rural, a little more remote areas of the metro area, if it appears to be a manufactured or mobile home, make sure that you've checked with the county that improvement has a certificate of affixation, meaning that it has become real estate. That's why this box is added to our contract here. If that is a mobile home or manufactured home that is not permanently attached to the land, doesn't have a certificate of affixation from the county in which it's located, then your buyer may not be able to get a loan on it, a real estate loan. In fact, I shouldn't say may not be able to, they won't be able to. If they're paying cash, it's less of a concern. We still have to address the box. But if they're getting a loan, the lenders, because that would really be a package loan, combining personal and real property, and lenders won't give a real estate loan to a property that has a mobile or manufactured home that is not permanently attached. So make sure that you're paying attention to that if it applies to you. And you would check the box if in fact it is a manufactured or mobile home, regardless of whether it's permanently affixed or not. So all of that from line 16 up is what I call the header. And so if I'm suggesting a correction to you on a form and I say in the header, we have to do this, I usually also try to reference the line numbers, but may not be able to or may have forgotten to. But so that's above it's everything above line 16 or above is called the header, because line 19 is where we start our paragraph number 1. So paragraph number 1, the identification of the property is what we deal with first. So on line 21, we have the street address. Make sure that you are filling it out in the order in which the form is asking for it. The street address, so that's the house number and then the street name, the city that it's in, the state that it's in, and the zip code that it's in. And then on line 23, make sure that you are adding in the county where the property is located. We do require the legal description. Here, not only the brokerage does, but KCRAR does, Kansas and Missouri both want it in there too. So since it's here, we have to address it. So starting on line 27, you can certainly cut and paste from county records for this. If there is a legal description in MLS, a separate legal description addendum, then what you would say in here is see attached legal description addendum. But we have to address this blank somehow. If there's a blank there, it has to be addressed. One of the states requires that, and my way of thinking is that if whatever is most restrictive, what one state wants us to do, I make sure that I do in both states, because regulations can change, laws take a little bit longer to change, but rules and regulations that KREC or MRCAN down to us can change at any time. So I just make sure that I am on the most conservative, restrictive side of either state. So we have to have our legal description here. It is also okay, and especially if it's a very lengthy legal description, and we can get those here in suburban metro area too, where they're very lengthy. Yes, you can shrink it down. .loop allows you to adjust the font size on here, but we want to make sure that it's legible. It is okay. I don't recommend this necessarily, but it is because I do want you looking at the legal description at the very least. It's okay to reference, leaving that up to the title company. I'm not even going to give you the correct verbiage for that, but because if it is a lengthy one and you need to not put the legal description in there, again, reach out to me, reach out to your coach, reach out to Kristen. I always say that, folks, and here's just, one of those little launch things too. It has nothing really to do with contracts. If you have a question about anything and you reach out to your coach and your coach is not available, because remember, your coaches have, they have businesses and they have lives, so they might not be available immediately when you need them, then reach out to me. I'm here for any question that you might have. And then if it's same thing with me, I have a business, I teach. I'm not always available during the day because I do teach the pre-exam classes. I teach these classes. And so, and I do have a life outside of real estate as well, but I also sell real estate. Then reach out to Kristen. She's always available to you, when she's available. So between those three, you should be able to catch one of us, or one of us should be able to call you back within 10, 15 minutes. And I know that sometimes it seems like a real emergency, but rarely. There are real estate emergencies, don't get me wrong, but rarely can nothing wait, rarely can it not wait for 10 or 15 minutes for a phone call back. But then the other people, it always call, Lynn is on that list too. Lynn is an excellent resource for helping through sticky situations, but she can help you through anything if you really cannot get anybody else. Don't ever take it upon yourself. Oh my gosh, I can't, I reached out to Damon and he didn't call me back right away, so I've got to take care of this myself. If there is anything that comes up in your business, anything that you're doing, that you have any concern or question about, anything that seems a little bit out of the ordinary, please don't take it upon yourself. You have no excuse for not reaching out and getting one of us. So, and so between those four, someone will be able to call you back shortly. All right, so there's that. Legal description. And back to that, because I know I get off on these little tangents and I can't understand why I can't get through all of this stuff in 2 hours. All right, so legal description. The next part of paragraph 1, starting on line 39, I do like to point out that this is a lot. In fact, the first sentence there, 39 and 40, are capitalized completely, and it's in bold, so it must be pretty important. So I do like to talk about this. So this is the personal property paragraphs here, and a part of this paragraph. The next several lines, and even going over onto the next page, are all about the personal property. The two biggest complaints that KREC and MREC get about from the public, from clients and customers, all boil around, number one, non-disclosure. So make sure you are disclosing everything that you need to disclose. And number two is that that someone feels that they were not given offers and counter offers promptly, or when a proper presentation of offers and counter offers. So those are the top two things, folks. So make sure that you are doing both of those. Don't call a seller and tell them that, well, I was just told we're getting an offer, because the minute you do that, that buyer will change their minds and not write it. So don't ever get a seller excited until you actually have that offer in hand, but make sure you contact them right away and let them know that they have an offer. The seller might make a decision that that they want to wait a couple of days before they look at any offers. But same thing about it, because we're doing most of this from the buyer's perspective. Same thing with your buyer. When there's a counter offer coming in, make sure you contact that buyer and let them know. They may not want to see it right away, or they may not be able to address it right away, but you make sure that you let them know that it's there for them. But then the disclosures here, personal property. So what basically what this part of this paragraph says is that we first look at the seller's disclosure if it's available. And here's another one of those things that I want to point out too. This paragraph is the first one that says something about the seller's disclosure, if there are differences between the seller's disclosure. And so if we don't have a seller's disclosure, we have to address that. And so hold that thought in your head, and we'll get to that here pretty soon. But the seller's disclosure is referenced a few times throughout our contract. And so if there is not one, we have to address it in the contract that there isn't one. And we have to do it properly. So, all right. So if there are differences between the seller's disclosure and the preprint and list below, the seller's disclosure governs. So what that's telling us is that we look at the seller's disclosure. On page 7 is where all of that personal property, or what might be considered personal property, is all listed out. All of the things that the seller could possibly take with them. And even though it does say furnace and air conditioner on that, could be that we also reference operational or non-operational or excluded on that form. So all of those things that you should be paying close attention to. After all, that is what we do, right? We are the ones that are watching out for our clients and our customers, for that matter, on all of those factual things. The devil is in the details, folks. So just make sure that you are reading it and reading it closely, and that you understand. You should be looking at that seller's disclosure really before you ever go look at the property. You should be forwarding that seller's disclosure to the buyer before you ever go look at the property. There may be something about that property that the buyer might decide, about the seller's disclosure. Well, let's not go see it. I've changed my mind. Another thing I would suggest is that you have the buyer drive by it before you make the appointment too, because sometimes there's something about the neighborhood or the house next door, or maybe we don't always see that the backyard has a slope towards the house, in those great pictures that the photographers give. So there might be all kinds of reasons why the buyer shouldn't or might not want to see that property, that you can kind of hammer out. It just saves everybody time on that. But back to this portion of the paragraph. So make sure that you are reading the seller's disclosure so that you know what the seller says is staying with the property or not staying with the property. And then we have a very specific list here, starting on line 46, 2 columns of things that Our contract says we expect these to remain with the property, that they are considered real estate. So let's read through this list really quickly. Any attached shelves, racks, towel bars, any attached lighting, any attached floor coverings, bathroom vanity mirrors, whether they are attached or just hung on a nail, we expect those to stay. Any fencing, including those buried pet systems, the electronic pet systems, fireplace grates, screens, and glass doors, any mounted entertainment brackets, the brackets, not the entertainment set itself, not the TV or computer screen itself, plumbing equipment and fixtures, storm windows, doors, and screens, windows, window blinds, curtains, coverings, and window mounting components. There are a couple in there that, especially the blinds, curtains, coverings, and mounting components, that seem to take sellers by surprise every time. So make sure that you are having that conversation with sellers. I sometimes forget to point out, so I'm so proud of myself that I'm remembering it here right off the bat, that all buyers have to initial all pages of the offer of the contract. The buyer signatures go on everything, go down at the bottom right-hand corner. So make sure all of your buyers are initialing. If you have this in your loop and you have your buyers named and assigned in the loop as buyers, identified as buyers, you can assign specific ones here, if that's the way you would prefer to do that. If you have more than 2 buyers, make sure that you're adding buyer signatures to the bottom, because you have plenty of space there to be doing that. We're still talking about personal property stuff here. Still in paragraph 1. Paragraph 1A deals with the electronic system and components. Upon closing, seller agrees to reset to factory settings or provide codes and passwords for all electronic systems or components of the property, including those components controlled remotely. So those are like the Nest systems, Blink systems, anything that is remaining with the property. The seller, the buyer needs access to those. So either they're reset to factory settings with the instructions on how to set those again, or the seller will provide all of the passcodes that are currently on it. I say those, it could be as simple as also as the garage door opener outside unit. So just again, devil's in the details, folks. That's part of our job, is to be looking for these kinds of things. Excuse me. Any additional inclusion? So let's read what this says. The following items, if any, supersede the seller's disclosure in the pre-printed list before, are considered to be part of the property and are included in the sale. So what we would be adding, what we would be putting in here is, if the seller says on the seller's disclosure that the kitchen refrigerator is not staying with the property, and your buyer really, 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 really wants that particular refrigerator, that's what we would do here. Anything that we are changing about the seller's disclosure, I think it's a little unnecessary to reiterate in this paragraph things that the seller's disclosure says are staying. If the seller says the refrigerator is staying, I think that you should not reiterate that in this paragraph. Now, once again, in that conversation with the listing agent that you're having, make sure that you can always verify that the seller's disclosure says that the refrigerator is staying and the washer and dryer is staying. Is that true? Is that correct? Because we want to make sure that, because here's the thing, and again, I know, but this has kind of become a thing. Linda says, not to reiterate anything in here, because then my concern is, if you say, well, if the seller says that the kitchen refrigerator is staying, and you say in this paragraph, kitchen refrigerator to remain, does that mean then that you don't care about the other things that the seller says are staying, operational and staying with the property, like the HVAC system or the water heater, and I know that's taking things to an extreme, but guess what happens? So it's always a misunderstanding. I told you what the 2 biggest complaints that MREC and KREC get about us, and the 2 biggest sources of disputes between buyers and sellers are, number 1, non-disclosure, and number 2, the personal property stuff. What one person thought was personal property and the other thought was real estate. So we wanted to absolutely make clear with that, and make sure that, I would even say, so I ask, if taking the same example, the seller says that the kitchen refrigerator is operational and staying OS, marked as OS on page 7 of the seller's disclosure, I would verify that with the listing agent by saying something along the lines of, so the seller's disclosure says that the kitchen refrigerator is operational and staying. Have you verified that with the seller? And that will be remaining. I ask it that way. Just double checking, folks, right? Because sometimes sellers don't understand. That's the other side of that argument, is that sometimes sellers don't understand what they are filling out. Well, whose fault is that? So, all right. I guess I should answer that question so you all don't think terrible things of me. It's the listing agent's fault, right? We are not supposed to help them fill it out, but I think you will be caught on compliance if anything is not filled out. So it's your job to make sure that they've addressed every question on the form. And then I think it's your job to also look through the page 7 and make sure that you say that you're leaving the washer and dryer. Right? That's what this is indicating. Is that really what you're doing? So yeah, it's not the seller's fault if they don't understand it. It's the listing agent's fault because they didn't explain it. All right. So that's what additional inclusions are. Something that the seller says is not staying with the property that the buyer wants. Paragraph 1C, starting on the box starts on line 67, the exclusions. The following items, if any, supersede the seller's disclosure and the pre-printed list before, are not considered to be part of the property and are not included in the sale. So anything that the seller says is staying with the property or is on the list before on the previous page that the buyer does not want. The play set in the backyard, the above ground swimming pool, those kinds of things that are listed on the seller's disclosure that the buyer doesn't want, we would put in this box. Line 1D, we're now kind of finished with the seller's disclosure. 1D is any additional terms and conditions that we're putting in there. And so what we use this box for is anything that the contract doesn't deal with somewhere else. So a big one here would be on the sample, Kristen uses the example of the seller to remove the dead tree that's in the northwest corner of the backyard. So that's not dealt with anywhere else in the contract. If you are trying to present a very strong offer in a competitive situation, and the buyer is going to offer to pay $1,500 of the seller's closing costs, that would be here because that's not dealt with anywhere else in our contract. So anything that is not dealt with specifically somewhere else is what goes in here. You'll see it's not a very big paragraph. Because once again, we are not licensed attorneys. And if you're maybe two of those things, right? Well, I mean, those two probably wouldn't go together necessarily, but if you're asking for more than one thing, I would number them and put them in here separately. Don't just make different, don't write a sentence, then put a period, then start another sentence. I would write them out separately. Well, again, we're not trying to trick anybody here. We want everything to be clear and concise and because all parties have to agree to all terms. So don't give the appearance that you're trying to trick someone, even though that's not what your intention was, but that might be the way that it comes across. So number them and put them out separately. Always, always, always check with someone about the proper verbiage on any of these 3 boxes, because once again, on box number 1B, especially when we're adding some personal property in there, we need to make sure that, we're not supposed to put personal property in our real estate contracts. It's a real estate contract, not a personal property contract. But there are some things on a very limited, very, very limited basis that we do deal with. Refrigerator, washer, and dryer are the most common ones. If your buyer wants to buy the dining room set or the entertainment center, entertainment set that's in the rec room, then all of that should really be dealt with separately. I think really at a separate time other than our initial negotiations. And that's the conversation I have with my buyer if they're walking through the property and see, 20 different things that they would like to ask the seller if they can purchase. So I would say, you know what, let's deal with the real estate first, then we'll deal with that other stuff. We don't want that stuff to squirrel our real estate transaction. So but the refrigerator, washer, and dryer are the most common. And so even though they shouldn't be on here because it's not a personal property contract, we quite often do deal with that. But the other entity that might be involved in this too would be the lender. Lenders don't like to see personal property in our real estate contracts because when then they send the contract to the appraiser might have to start putting a value on that personal property. None of us want that to happen. So we have to have special verbiage in there that it doesn't have any value and it does a convenience and all of that. So make sure that you talk with someone about the proper verbiage on any of these boxes here. Then it's almost break time, but we'll try to get through a few more pages here. So paragraph 1E, the limited home warranty paragraph, this was added in for us last year. We have to address either the box on line 83 or the box on line 85, that the buyer is waiving the opportunity for a home warranty, whether that means that we're not asking the seller to pay for it and the buyer's not going to pay for it. The reason this is in here is because this is part of our E&O insurance requirements. We have to have had that conversation with the buyer, and this is our evidence that we did have that conversation with the buyer, that they had the opportunity to purchase a home warranty. They had the opportunity either to ask the seller to buy it for them or to purchase it themselves. So that's why this paragraph is in here. We have to address one of the two paragraphs. If we are either asking the seller to purchase it, or even if the buyer's purchasing it themselves, then we fill in the second part of that paragraph, check the box on line 85, and put in all of the details and the cost not to exceed, and who's purchasing it. And on line 86, who is the provider of the plan? Are we going with AB May or the first? It's not First American. That was the one I'm thinking about, or Cinch, or any number of them that we have here. Make sure if you are including one here that the buyer has been given the opportunity to purchase, if they've been given the information about more than one. This is one of those, in every situation, you should be, if the buyer, even if the buyer asks you for a recommendation, give them 3. And then, they'll say, which one would you choose? And my answer to that would be, well, I wouldn't be offering them to you if I wouldn't choose them. I would choose any one of these. Here are the brochures. You make your decision on that. One of those things that you can have them do as you are preparing to write the contract here. So, and then on line 91, who is going to be ordering the home warranty? Even if we're asking the seller to do it, I usually check the box that the licensee, the second box there, the licensee assisting the buyer, because I will take that responsibility on myself just because I want to make sure that it's done. We'll get through the addenda before we take our break here. So paragraph number 2, the addenda that are become part of our contract here. And this is why I said to hold on to the thought about the seller's disclosure. Since the seller's disclosure is talked about throughout the contract in a few different places, we can't just not check the box here and remove it. The seller's disclosure and condition of property addendum, if there is one, does become part of our contract. The buyer will initial and sign, initial and sign that they have, that's just their acknowledgement that they've seen it. If there is not one, just not checking the box here doesn't remove it from the contract. That is one of those things that we would put up in line 75, in the box on line 75, paragraph 1D, that buyer and seller acknowledge there is no seller's disclosure available on this property. Because again, that's one of our E&O insurance requirements, is that there is a seller's disclosure. So we have to address it in one way. Just not checking the box won't remove it from the contract. We actually have to acknowledge that it's not there. If it's a property built before 1978, you have to have the lead-based paint disclosure. So we would check that box. If your buyer is making this contingent upon the sale and or closing of their current property, you would check that box. Then there are plenty of other addenda that we would put in here if they apply. If the listing brokerage has included their franchise addendum and affiliated business disclosure, and want your buyer to sign it, then we would add that in here. Check that would be one of the other boxes. As we're heading into cold weather here, we might have the cold weather waiver in here. If your buyer is making an offer, if the seller either if the seller has added in the additional documents, or if your buyer's making an offer with it in its present condition attached to it. That's another common one that we see here. Those are the most common ones. So, but there are lots of addenda out there. I haven't hit on all of them lately. I'll probably do that next month, go through the whole list. So just make sure that you are adding any addenda in here, but be very careful and make sure that you are, if it is a property that doesn't have a seller's disclosure available, that you actually remove it, or you not removing it, but you're just saying that both parties acknowledge it back in paragraph 1D. All right, it's 9:52. Let's take our 10-minute break. I will see you all in 10 minutes. There we go. Now you can hear me. Good morning to everyone on Facebook. I saw that Lauren is with us and Ashley. So good morning, everyone. And I'm sure there will be people that will be referencing this after the fact too. So anytime you have any questions, anyone that's here on Facebook, make sure that you post a question. I will check it before we end for the morning. And of course, Connor, if you have anything, either just chime in at any point. So I'm going to, because I've got it on Facebook again. So 1 second. There we go. All right, sharing screen again. All right, so we got through then the bottom of page 2 with the addenda paragraph number 2. There are a few paragraphs here, or subparagraphs. Again, it's not that they're not important, but today we're just going through the things that we're filling out. Excuse me. So we get to line 135, seller and or buyer is a licensed real estate broker or salesperson. You should know from MLS whether or not the listing agent or whether the seller is licensed, because it's one of those things that should be referenced in MLS in the comments section. You will know if you are the buyer, or if your buyer is licensed anywhere. You should know, because even though Missouri and Kansas are both named here on lines 136, 137, we also have the other there. Both Kansas and Missouri want it to be disclosed if your buyer is licensed in Idaho or Connecticut. So if they're licensed anywhere, it should be referenced on here. Even though Kansas and Missouri are both named there, it's any state. So you should be notified if the seller is licensed anywhere, and you should know if your buyer is licensed anywhere. And then we get down to line 139, 140, and 141. Licensee assisting seller is an immediate family member of. Again, that should be disclosed in MLS. If it's not, when you are talking with the seller, with the listing agent, they might make that disclosure there to you. So make sure that you reference that here. But once again, you will know if your buyer is an immediate family member of you. But we do address those only if they apply. And again, it's not that it's not important. We're just getting through to page 4 here, paragraph number 4, page 4 is where we deal with the purchase price. The purchase price for the property is on line 164. So this is the amount of money that your buyer is offering for this property, whether it's list price, below, or above. This is the offer price. If you're making an offer and asking the seller to pay some of the closing costs, which we'll deal with down at the bottom of this page, you may have to kind of bump this up. So make sure you're talking with your buyer about all of that. Again, all your responsibility is not to tell the buyer what to offer. And of course, you're going to have buyers that will ask you that. Well, what do you think we should offer? That never, ever, ever answer that question, please. Give them all of the information that they need to make that decision themselves. So you might be suggesting things like, well, since we're asking for $4,500 down here, and we know we're in competition with at least one other offer, maybe we should bump this up to for another $4,500. But again, always make sure that you are considering whether the property is going to appraise for that or not, because that's a whole secondary thing. All right. Then on line 167, starting with the earnest money, we are going to read this one together. Earnest money will be delivered to licensee assisting the seller or their escrow agent within, and we have a blank there, but we have our default of three calendar days. So if you are knowing that you're going to be collecting a check from your buyer, if you need more than 3 days to collect that check and get it to the listing agent or the title company that's holding it. And if you need more than 3 days to do that, this would be the time to address that and make sure that you're talking with the listing agent about that. 3 calendar days. If it's going to be a direct deposit, make sure that you are on top of your buyer all the time to make sure that that's done within that, because then we get to line 172, again in bold, so it must be pretty important. If earnest money is not delivered during the delivery period, seller may cancel this contract by written notice once the delivery period has ended and prior to delivery of the earnest money. So seller says, seller has the power there. If I haven't received your earnest money, which was part of my decision, wasn't consideration of the contract, but part of the seller's decision to accept this contract, if I haven't received it when the contract says that I should have, then I can cancel the contract. Seller has that power. And then on line 176, we are talking about the earnest money itself. Line 176 is where we put the amount of. Bear in mind, folks, that earnest money is not a necessary part of the contract. It is not the consideration for the contract. It is not required. However, most sellers won't consider an offer that doesn't have some earnest money associated with it. It's kind of become the industry standard here. I don't know exactly when this happened, of 1%. If your buyer is able to do that, but again, make sure that they understand the risks of it. Yes, there are times throughout the contract that the buyer has the ability to cancel the contract with written notice, but also remember, don't ever, ever, ever say to the buyer, oh, well, you will get your earnest deposit back. Because remember, seller number 1 has to sign the cancellation, or neither party is released. If they don't sign it, neither party is released from their obligations to the contract. And seller has to sign for the disbursement of the earnest deposit. Both of those things happen on one form. One signature does both of those things. So make sure that your buyer understands that their money is at risk. So, from a seller's point of view, they want to collect as much earnest deposit as possible. From a buyer's standpoint, we want to be able to put as little of our buyer's money at risk as possible. But again, it's one of those things that the seller in their mind may require it. It is not required per contract law, but the seller may require it, if that makes sense. All right, so then we have the amount on line 176, then on 178, we have the form of that earnest deposit. We do have check, electronic transfer, and ACH all in one checkbox there. Those are the most common. In 38 years of selling real estate, I've never had another form of earnest deposit made, but it can be anything that's of value that the two parties agree on. If the buyer decided that they wanted to offer a title to a vehicle or wanted to offer stocks and bonds, as long as the seller is agreeable to accepting that, then we could check that box, the other box there. And then on line 180, we've deposited with, and this is where we would look on MLS to see down at close to the bottom of the MLS information sheet, it says earnest deposit 2. And then that's most of the time now it's a title company. I don't know of any broker that collects them and themselves to put in their own escrow account, but always double check. It's not the title company your buyer is going to be using, it's the one that the seller is going to be using. So make sure you're double checking that. Make sure buyer acknowledges that funds payable to and held by the seller will not be held subject to the terms of the earnest money additional deposits agreement. Rarely will you have the earnest deposit made out to the seller. Sometimes in new construction that is the case, but rarely in our resale market would that happen. But if it does happen, make sure that your buyer understands that the seller doesn't have to release that. Again, money is even more at risk under those circumstances. Rarely do it in a resale would we deal with that in paragraph 1B. That might come more into play in paragraph 1C, starting on line 186. We rarely use this anyway. That's one of those situations if the buyer doesn't have only has a certain amount of money available, we put it in on line 176. On line 186, the buyer might in their offer indicate that more will come after the after the effective date, or whatever. However, the buyer or the seller can also ask for additional. So that and that might be then under certain situations, certain circumstances where the seller may say, well, I'm going to ask for additional earnest money and I want that made out to me. So nothing illegal about that. Just make sure that your buyer understands that that money is definitely at risk. They might not ever see that if and it will be released at closing, but not necessarily if the buyer cancels the contract, even under one of their allowances in the contract. So then on line 196, total amount financed by buyer. This is going to require a little bit of math. I know that 4-letter word, but this is an easy one for you. You're going to take the sales price minus whatever down payment the buyer is making. The sales price minus the down payment. You'll probably get a good clue of what that's going to be on the pre-approval letter. Even if your sales price doesn't match the pre-approval letter, you may be offering less. Don't offer more. If you do, make sure you get a new pre-approval letter that covers whatever you're offering there. But it should say whether it's an FHA with minimum down payment, or whether it's a 10% down loan or 20% down loan. Excuse me. And it may not say it in those words. It may say it's an 80% conventional loan. Well, then you know that they're financing 80%, down payment is 20%. So what we put on line 196 is the purchase price minus the down payment. Then this is the calculation that the form will do for you. It doesn't know how to do the other because it doesn't know what kind of loan your buyer is going to be using. There's no way for them to put that in an algorithm, but you do. But this is what the with calculations form does for you. Then that form will fill in line 201 for you. If you're using without calculations, then you go ahead and do what this paragraph tells you to do. Purchase price minus what's on line B, minus what's on line C, minus what's on line D. So this is then the money that the buyer is expected to be bringing to the closing table for their down payment. But remember, you've already used that up here in the earnest deposit. So sales price minus the earnest deposit, minus any additional earnest deposit, minus what they're financing. So this is what we expect the buyer to be bringing for their down payment, because theoretically what they put as the earnest deposit is applied to their down payment. It gets a little confusing when you're dealing with 0% down loans, such as a VA or a USDA, or some of the lender down payment assisted programs. This would always be 0. You don't put a negative number in here, it's always going to be 0. Then we get to line 206, additional seller paid costs. We call it additional costs because there are some costs that the contract calls for the seller to pay for. So what we are putting here are, you take your estimate of your buyer's estimated closing costs. Oh yeah, because you have to do that with every offer that you're writing. You take your estimate there, have the conversation with the buyer. So we've kind of figured that you're going to need to bring $6,000 to closing. Are we going to be asking the seller for that? Do you have funds to cover that? Asking the seller to pay for part of it. So this is a conversation to have with your buyer. Make sure that they understand their costs over and above their down payment. If they don't have the cash for that, you're going to have to ask the seller. And this is what I was talking about. Sometimes we have to bump up the sales price a little bit. If the seller is probably more concerned about what the bottom line is, that their net proceeds from all of this, most sellers don't really care how things are spent up above that line. They just care what the bottom line is. So if we're asking the seller to pay any closing costs on behalf of the buyer, that's what we would put in on line 208. Then Costs not payable by buyer. There, I don't know of any specific federal government related loan anymore that won't let the buyer pay for everything, but some of the lender assisted programs may have something in there that the buyer cannot pay for. One of the common ones used to be that the buyer couldn't pay for the termite inspection, but that's been taken out of everything now. So most of the time this is going to be zero, but check with your lender, especially if your buyer's on some kind of specialized program. And so then line 215 is the total of line 208 and 213. The total that we're asking the seller to provide at closing towards the buyer's closing costs. Line 235, closing and possession. So this is where we tell the seller, hey, we're planning on closing on this date. Another one of those questions that you ask the listing agent, how can we accommodate the seller's preferences for closing and possession date? If your buyer has any flexibility, that's a great negotiating tool for you. If your buyer doesn't have any flexibility, then, you might want to relay that to the listing agent and say, this is what they have to do. If there's any, if there may be a day or two in there, but this is what they have to do. So we actually name our closing date here on line 235. Well, I guess a little trickier is on line 250, the possession date. If the seller is planning on being out of the property by closing, even if they're occupying it now, then again, I would verify if they are occupying the property now. I would ask the listing agent, are they planning on being out on closing, or do they need a day or two after closing? If your buyer is willing to do that, if everything works out that way. But if you're showing a vacant house, it's really not a concern. So it gets a little trickier here on line 250. Seller, starting on line 249, seller will deliver possession of the property to buyer on, and so we have our date here. Go ahead and put the date in if it's anything other than closing date. If it is closing date, you can leave this blank. I know a lot of people out there don't like to leave blanks on forms. I guess I kind of get that. I just, as we get further into the document, it's like sometimes I think it might be confusing the issue, but you can go ahead and put the closing date in here. That's fine. I wouldn't, especially if it's a vacant house, you can leave it blank. The time is what I'm talking about here, because as anybody, even though the form says 5 and your buyer closes at 1 and wants to start moving in at 3, is anybody going to come back at you for those 2 hours in a vacant property? Probably not. But don't put funding. You'll see those coming through. I think we've kind of knocked it out of not using that a lot here in our brokerage, at least with the launch agents. I don't see that coming through anymore. But don't put it. You will see it coming through on offers. I still see it a lot, but it really means nothing. So even though you might see it, don't think it's a good idea. Don't put funding. We're going to have a specific date and time in here. That's the best and only way really that we can enforce possession, is to have a specific date and time in here. So, but if it's an occupied property and say the seller is asking to remain a day or two after closing, then absolutely put the actual date in here and put the actual time in here. That, again, that's the only way that we can legally enforce that, if the seller hasn't left the property. Hate to put those negative things out there, but sometimes we have to do that. If you are on line 261, another blank here, if it's a cash sale, your buyer has the opportunity to have an appraisal done, and our contract allows that here within the inspection period. So whatever is negotiated as the inspection period in a cash transaction would also be considered the appraisal period. If your buyer's getting a loan, it's all talked about later here. But if it's cash sale, buyer has the opportunity to have their own appraisal done. All of the same things apply. If the appraisal comes in lower than our sales price, apply to both parties here. So on line 267, if an appraised value, whether it's a cash sale or a loan sale. If the appraisal comes in lower, line 267 tells us that we have 5 days, unless we negotiate something different, that the buyer has to notify the seller that there's a difference in and that they want to renegotiate. Line 270 has another blank in here. And again, our contract allows 5 days for our appraisal negotiation period. Once the seller has received a copy of the appraisal, and that is the only time that the seller will receive a copy of the appraisal, is if the buyer wants to reopen negotiations based upon the appraisal coming in lower than the sales price. So once the seller has that in hand, we now have 5 days to negotiate what's going to happen. Is the seller going to come down the full amount, the difference? Is the seller maybe going to come down in price somewhere between the appraisal price and the listing price? Or is the seller going to say, nope, you said you're going to pay this for it, this is what I expect to get? So we have 5 days to work that out, or not, one or the other. Paragraph number 7, sale contingency. We are notifying the seller here, even though we might have included the contingency for sale or closing of buyer's current property in our addendum. This is where we are stating the fact that either the sale is contingent upon the buyer selling and or closing on their current property, or it is not contingent. If it's not, we check line 285. If it is, we check line 287. One of those two lines has to be addressed. Financial terms. If it is a cash sale, we would check the box on line 293 and ignore the rest of this paragraph. This is our financial contingency paragraph. So there are lots of things in here that protect the buyer. If it is a loan transaction, if it's cash, check the box on line 293 and move on. If it is a finance sale, if there is a loan involved for the buyer, then you would check the box on line 296. And the paragraph below that tells us that the buyer can, even though we're making a lot of disclosures here, the buyer can change loans during the process as long as they don't result in any additional costs to seller or delay the closing costs or change the loan approval timeframe. If those changes apply, then we have to get the seller to agree to that in writing. Line 308, the type of financing. Please don't overlook this line. One of these two boxes has to be checked. If it's an owner-occupied loan or if it's an investment loan. Number one, 2 different kinds of loans there. Number 2, you'll have some sellers that don't want to sell to an investor. Again, I would maybe try to counsel them away from that. It's really just the bottom line, but some sellers say, well, I don't want to do that to my neighbors, or I don't want to do that to the neighborhood. Well, I get that. However, let's just worry about your money. But we do make that disclosure here so that the seller has the opportunity to base their decision upon that information. Please, please, please check one of the boxes on line 313 through 317. We, for the most part, can ignore the secondary loan column over there. We're dealing mostly with the primary loan. It's been years since I've seen a secondary loan in there. That's usually when there's some kind of loan for at least part of the down payment in there. So although I think some of the lender assisted programs really should be secondary loans, you don't get the information from the lender that way, but yeah, I shouldn't try to confuse that situation. 99.9% of the time, you're going to be dealing with just the primary loan paragraph here. So please, please, please check check the appropriate boxes on line 313 through 317. Also, make sure that you are checking one of the boxes through 320 through 323. Most of the time it's going to be a fixed rate loan, but as we are getting into higher interest rates, volatile interest rates, you're certainly going to have buyers that are getting an adjustable rate loan. Again, your pre-approval letter should tell you which one it is. On line 325, the amortization period, again, should be on the pre-approval letter. Is this a 15-year note? Is it a 20-year note? Is it a 30-year note? And the principal amount or loan to value, this one seems to confuse people. Yes, you can put the principal amount, again, the amount financed, on this line. Contract says you can. I prefer to put the loan to value there, because then if there's a counter offer, some negotiation that goes on, we don't have to worry about addressing this line. Loan to value is expressed as, if your buyer is getting an 80% loan, putting 20% down, then you have an 80/20 loan. If it's an FHA loan with minimum down payment, then it's a 96.5/3.5 loan. That's the loan to value. That's what I prefer that you use, but of course that's what I prefer to use. But of course you can use the principal amount. It's just if a counter offer is made, we have to make sure that we change that line too. And this is another one that some agents kind of tend to slide by. I'm not going to let you slide by on this one. Again, dealing with just the primary loan. The interest rate not exceeding blank per annum. So that's the interest rate that we're dealing with. It may or may not be quoted on the pre-approval letter. Again, since we are in a time of volatile interest rates can change quickly. Make sure that your buyer is willing and able to pay whatever the market rate is of interest the day they close. That's what that line is all about. If they say, well, no, if interest rates get to above 8%, I don't want to pay that, or I'm not qualified to pay that. So maybe it's not just the buyer you're having this conversation with, it might be the loan officer also. Then we would cap it on line 333. Whatever the cap would be on line, it goes on line 333. If they are willing to pay whatever the interest rate is the day of closing, then we would check the box on line 334, the prevailing rate at closing. And that's called floating the interest rate, or if we're going to cap the interest rate. So one of those two boxes has to be checked. And if we are going to cap it, we put it at what we are going to cap it, the interest rate we're going to cap it. Again, ignore the secondary loan unless you know for a fact that the buyer's getting a secondary loan. Then on line 349, we're still in paragraph number 8. The buyer is pre-approved. Check the box on line 349. And what's most important to put in there is the name of the lending institution. You, of course, can put the loan officer's name in there as well, but lending institution for sure, and the loan officer's name also in there. Important information to have. If you put in Bank of America and the agent or the sellers had a bad experience with Bank of America, they deserve to know that. They can always make a counteroffer requesting you to get a pre-approval from another lender. So, conversation to have with the buyer. Please, I can't imagine that you would ever be writing an offer and have to check the box on line 357. So just make sure that you're not out showing properties to buyers without a pre-approval letter. And please don't be writing an offer without the buyer having a pre-approval letter. You may not have one in hand, and it may be expecting to get one, but again, most lenders can have those to you within an hour. It's going to take you that long to be writing up the contract anyway. If you can't get one for another day or two, then I suppose that might be a time for you to check 357. Just make sure that you are in contact with the listing agent to tell them that we've got one coming, we just don't have it in hand. Paragraph 8E is one that I think a lot of agents kind of slide over and don't pay any attention to. Let's talk about it here for just a second. Lines 363 through 366. Buyer agrees to make a good faith effort to obtain a commitment. That's the loan commitment letter within, and we have a blank here, but we have our 45 days as the default there. 45 days if left blank from the effective date of this contract, or within, and again, another blank, and our default being 5 if we don't negotiate something else, prior to the closing date, whichever is earlier. We call this the loan approval period. If you're asking for a 30-day loan, 30-day closing, so the lender has told you they can close, they get it closed within 30 days. That's when the 5 calendar days shows up, within 5 calendar days prior to the closing date. This is the one and only time, if your buyer's getting a loan, that we can prove that we have a ready, willing, and able buyer. we get clear to close sometimes, just right under the wire. We get clear to close, and that is not the commitment letter. That is a commitment from the lender, but is not the commitment letter. I suggest that any time that you, and most lenders are, they're dealing with things as they have to. So on most loans, we're getting that clear to close just before, again, the 3 RESPA days, those requirements. If those have been waived by both parties, then sometimes it's just a couple of hours before closing. So, those things happen, but if your lender's been on top of it and we have a clear to close well ahead of the time, then ask the lender for a copy of a commitment letter. They know what you're talking about. They know they're supposed to do it. We just, when we're real close to the closing date, we don't always, but that's our proof that we have a ready, willing, and able buyer there. Lender appraisal requirements, line 377, subparagraph 8F. Here, seller agrees to pay an amount not to exceed, and our 0 is our default here. These are appraisal requirements. You're not going to run across this very much on, very often on conventional lending. Typically, there aren't a lot of appraisal requirements on conventional loans, but certainly on those federally related loans, FHA, VA, USDA, the appraiser, because they're looking at things not just for value, but for structural integrity and livability of the property, health, safety, and welfare of the borrower, then those government related loans may have some appraisal requirements. If we have left this at 0, the seller is under no obligation to make those repairs. So this is one of those things that if you know your buyer's an FHA or VA buyer, as you're walking through the property, and you see that there are things that an FHA or VA appraiser would see, you might want to put a dollar amount in here. If you see that there's a set of steps that doesn't have a handrail, if you see that there's some flaking paint in a property built before 1978, that's a huge red flag for the government related loans. So you may want to put a dollar amount in here. But once again, if you're trying to make a really, really, really strong offer, you've offered all kinds of other stuff, you probably wouldn't want to put things in here. But just bear in mind that on those federally related loans specifically, we can't close unless those repairs are done. Buyer shouldn't do them. Buyer can't do them. They don't own the property yet. So the buyer shouldn't be making any repairs. We're asking the seller to. There's no renegotiation if we have an amount in there, as long as the repairs fall within that amount. Sellers already agreed to do the repairs. If we leave it at 0, then it becomes a negotiating factor. All right, then we get into few other paragraphs here that we don't necessarily have to address, but we get to paragraph number 13 here that deals with inspections, and we have a blank here. Buyer may within blank calendar days, and our default here is 10, and that we are now going to call our inspection period. This is the time frame that the buyer has to get all of their inspections done, even including if their whole house inspector suggests that you get a roof inspector out, and you call the roof inspector out, that secondary inspection has to be done within whatever time frame is negotiated here, our default being 10. So make sure that you are allowing enough time here to do all of the inspections that your buyer wants to do and that may come up. It all depends on how busy inspectors are and what inspections the buyer wants to do. Whatever, a mold inspection will usually take a little bit longer than getting a whole house inspection. You may have to wait a day or two if you're going to get a special HVAC person out there. So make sure you're allowing enough time. And then as we are heading here into the end of the year, make sure that you are allowing for enough time around holiday days. Good luck getting an inspector to come out on, Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, maybe. They may not be available. Inspectors are allowed to take time off too. So they may not be available the week between Christmas and New Year. So make sure that you're checking with your inspectors on all of that and that you are allowing enough time. Make sure it wouldn't necessarily be a major concern, this week or maybe even next week. But as we get into the middle of December, make sure that you are not asking your buyer to get their inspections done in the 2 days before Christmas. All right. Or that you've allowed enough time and that your inspectors are available. Lots of other stuff that's dealt with here in this paragraph about insurability, what happens if we have unacceptable conditions, what is the definition of an unacceptable condition? Oh, let's talk about that here on line 525. What is not an unacceptable condition? The following items will not be considered unacceptable conditions and cannot be used by buyer as a reason to cancel or renegotiate this contract. Any items marked excluded on seller's disclosure and condition of property addendum in addition to the following items will not be considered as unacceptable conditions. Another reason for you to carefully read page number 7 in the seller's disclosure. Look at the things that are marked EX, because if something comes up wrong on the inspections, buyers still certainly can do their inspections, but if something comes up on the inspection report about those EX items, those cannot be used to cancel the contract, or you cannot ask for the seller to repair those. It's the whole definition of EX. It says that clearly on the seller's disclosure. It also says it clearly here. I can't imagine that your buyer would actually add anything in here, but this is something that might be added during a counter offer. The seller may say, okay, well, we will accept that low offer. However, we are also going to exclude, in addition to what we've already excluded on the seller's disclosure, we are also going to exclude this, and add something to it. So that would show up on a counter offer, possibly. And imagine your buyer would be putting something in here, and unless, again, of course, they are trying to make it a very attractive offer to the seller. Then on line 548, resolution of unacceptable conditions. Buyer and seller will have blank calendar days. Our default is 5. After seller's receipt of buyer's inspection notice, resolution of unacceptable conditions. And we call this 5-day period the renegotiation period. This is when, if we are asking the seller to make repairs or to renegotiate the price or possibly closing costs, we have 5 days to do that. On the inspection period, we have the ability to ask for fewer, or offer fewer, or ask for more than 10. Same thing here. I wouldn't ask for fewer. I might extend this to 7 days, and especially if you think there might be things that show up on the inspection report. But on both of these, if we are going to extend them, which we can extend these. We can extend any of the timeframes throughout the contract. We just have to have an amendment. If we are going to extend it, make sure you're doing it within the given timeframe. If we are still negotiating on our 5th day and both parties are negotiating in good faith, and you say, well, let's take another couple of days, make sure that you have that extension, that amendment extending our renegotiation period done and signed by all parties before the end of this the initial 5 days. So hope that made sense. All right, then lots of stuff here. The defaults and remedies. What happens if one party defaults on the contract? What options does the other party have? Some required disclosures here in paragraph number 16 about hazardous issues, environmental issues on the property. But I definitely, before we break, I want to, for the end of the class, I want to talk about paragraph number 20. Page 13 of our contract here, the brokerage relationship disclosure. I'm going to read the first line there on line 673. Seller and buyer acknowledge the real estate brokerage relationship brochure has been furnished to them, and the brokerage relationships were disclosed to them no later than the first showing, upon first contact, or immediately upon the occurrence of any change to that relationship. So this is probably the second time that your client is acknowledging, saying, yes, I received that brokerage disclosure. Whether the property is in Missouri or the property is in Kansas, that they have received the proper disclosure. So make sure that they have received it, that you've shared it with them. Again, that you have, I think that you should make the verbal disclosures about how you are representing them. And at this point, you know how the other party is being represented. So make sure that your client understands that as well. If on the listing sheet you find out that this property is listed by a designated seller's agent, make sure your buyer understands that they have someone helping them negotiate too. All right, so then we get down to the actual disclosure part of it here. As the licensee assisting the buyer, the one that typically is going to be filling out this form, you're going to need to fill out everything completely, because you can't ask someone to sign something that's not filled out completely. So you have to make the disclosures on both sides. That all of that information is available to you on MLS. MLS tells you right below the listing agent's name and the listing agent's brokerage and the listing agent's email address. Right below that, it will have, it's called LACAP, listing agent capacity. That is the role that the listing agent is playing as it relates to the seller here. Most of the time, it's going to be a designated seller's agent. Also, it could be a seller's agent, because if it's the supervising or named broker of that brokerage that is representing the seller, they have to be a seller's agent. So that would be then your second most common. There are brokerages here in the Kansas City metro area that don't represent sellers, that work only as transaction brokers. So make sure that you are looking it up on the MLS sheet, because it's clearly written right there. And that you are checking the appropriate box. You are also then checking the box on how you are working with that buyer. You will never be a buyer's agent. You will always be a designated buyer's agent, or it could possibly be a transaction broker. But again, that's a whole special situation. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you are not representing either party, make sure you reach out and let me know that. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you could possibly be showing a property to a buyer you're representing and it is your listing, don't show the property until you have a conversation with your coach or me or Kristen or Lynn. You can't do that. So that would be considered dual agency. Your broker does not allow you to practice dual agency, so don't let yourself get in that position. So come talk to someone before then. So, but you could be working as a transaction broker if you're not representing either party. If that's the case, then if you're working as a transaction broker, you're working with a buyer you're not representing, and you're writing the offer on a for sale by owner property, so therefore you're not representing the seller either, then that's a whole different kettle of fish on what you're going to be disclosing here. If that is the case, then let's go back to the licensee assisting the seller. Because if you are showing a for sale by owner and writing an offer on a for sale by owner, that is you. You are the licensee assisting the seller. You would absolutely make sure that you have disclosed that. If you are the designated buyer working as the designated buyer's agent, then you would check the box on line 704, and you would check the box on line 707. That the person assisting the seller is representing the buyer and the seller is not represented. If you are not representing either party, then you would check the box on line 698. You're working as a transaction broker, because by definition, that means you're not representing either party. And also the line 707, that the seller is not being represented. And those same boxes on the buyer's side, right? If you are selling offering on a for sale by owner and you are representing the buyer, then you would disclose that you are working as a designated buyer's agent and the seller's not being represented. Or if you're working as a transaction broker not representing either party, then you would check the transaction brokerage and check the box that the buyer's not being represented, as well as the box that the seller's not being represented. Really confusing stuff. So most of the time, though, we hope that you're going to be representing a buyer, that you're representing the buyer and you're getting the property through MLS. So that makes it pretty cut and dried. Anything else, come talk to your coach about it. On line 714, brokers are compensated by, and at this point in time, again, always, always, always make sure that you are checking the MLS so that you know whether you're being compensated by the seller or not. We're going to start probably seeing more and more listings that will show $0 that you're not being compensated by the seller. So again, before you ever show the property, make sure that you are verifying that information. If the seller's not paying you through MLS, if MLS is not letting you know that the seller's paying you, that's the conversation to have with the buyer, and the time to have it is before you show the property. But at this point in time, you can probably still, for the most part, be expected to be compensated by the seller. So we would check that. And if you are representing the buyer or have a payment agreement with an unrepresented buyer, then you are also being paid commission compensation by that buyer. Most of the time, you're going to be checking both of those boxes, that you're being compensated by the seller and the buyer. And then this is the one and only place in the contract that you are signing within the contract itself, but you are then signing as the licensee assisting the buyer. If it's a for sale by owner, you'd be signing on the other side as well. And then have your buyer sign page 13. The only thing that we're signing here, number one, is that we have made the disclosures to the best of our ability. And number two, that the buyers and sellers that are signing here, and our contract says it right here, on line 716, signatures below only apply to the brokerage relationship disclosure. This portion of the paragraph number 8 or 20 on page 13. Counter offers and back and forth, that we are still good with this form once we have signed this form on here. All right, lots of other stuff here, but we are running out of time. I want to make sure that I do my sign off here. I never can remember what days Kristen needs her Zoom back, because since I'm using her Zoom on here, we of course can have an expiration date on any of our offers. We do have a default. It's not hanging out there forever and ever. We do have a default here of 5 days. That's an awfully long time for an offer to be sitting out there. Yes, of course, your buyer can always rescind the offer, retract the offer anytime before we have communication of acceptance. But that's an awfully long time for an offer to be sitting out there, unless, of course, you show the property on Tuesday and you're told that the seller's not going to be looking at the property until Sunday. And again, you can put any day in here. And even if you're told that the seller's not going to be looking at offers until Sunday, if you have made a very, very, very strong offer, nothing really preventing the buyer or from the listing agent from showing it to the seller, because I've seen that happen here. You can say, no, I want mine presented before then, right? They have to present it. They have to let one know, unless they've been told specifically by the seller, oh, don't even contact me until Saturday. I don't want to see anything until Saturday. You can request it, but we can't enforce it. All right. So we have our default there. If anything different than 5 days, I would certainly put something in there. Anything different than 5 o'clock, I would certainly put something in there. Then we have our signatures down here on line, starting on line 843. Again, seller's going to sign on the left-hand side, buyer is going to sign on the right-hand side. You put in your brokerage information, the brokerage address, your name as the licensee assisting the buyer, your contact information, the broker contact information, and your email address. On the left-hand side, you can get all of this information from the MLS information sheet. So it's a real nice thing for you to go ahead and put it in there. Again, one of those things that the listing agent is going to be looking at. If you don't bother to put that in there, their first thought might be, oh my gosh, what a lazy agent, right? All of that information was on MLS, and your offer may not be taken, your buyer's offer may not be taken seriously because of that little detail. Yes, folks, those little details. One other thing, because we do have a couple of minutes here, then I want to let you know. And I think that I'm saying this correctly. It is one way or the other. Back here on page 4, if you put in $190,000 and write it in as the $190, 000, period 00, indicating sense, I believe that within the numbers that you are asking the calculations to put in, I believe, come in without cents in them. We rarely deal with cents in a real estate sales contract. You might deal with odd little numbers, but cents probably not. So I think that's the way it is. If you put cents in and the contract doesn't, and the calculations that it does for you, that's one thing that I know some agents look for. And I know this seems like a really, really, really petty detail, but it is a detail, and agents can do whatever they want to do, right? And have whatever conversations they want to have with the seller. So, but one thing that you can control for sure is putting in the listing agent's information over on the left-hand side of the last page of our 16-page contract back here. So make sure that you're getting the correct information. And then once you send this to me and I've approved it all, then you're going to send it to your buyer for their signatures. Then when you receive it back from your buyer, all signed by all parties, then and only then will you sign on line 877. But you do have to sign on line 877, just not until after your buyer has signed it, because you're now certifying that no one has made any changes to the form. You can't certify that before your buyer signs it. You can only certify that after your buyer signs it. So once you get it back from your client before you send it on to the listing agent, then you will sign line 877. All right, folks, that's it. Didn't get to anything extra today, but on Wednesday, we do talk about, Kristen has a power tool called Ready to Write an Offer. If you want to go ahead and go get that, again, that's on the portal, or it is also in the files in the launch Facebook page. So again, it's called Ready to Make an Offer. That's what we're going to be going over, at least the first part of the day on Wednesday, and then where we go to get information and that kind of thing too. So actually writing the offer. We've just did a bunch of talking here today. So, all right, so that's it. Gonna stop share.
Thanks, Linda. That was a great overview.
Thank you, Connor. I'm so glad you were here. Thanks for the comment. I appreciate that. I'm going to quickly check Facebook to see if any questions came through here. Helen's here also. All right, that's it. No questions. So back here. All right, Linda, at my email address is contractscoach@kwk.com. My phone number is 913-219-2289. Please text if you are going to be writing a contract for sure. I really appreciate the heads up. Even if you're just going to be out showing properties, let me know that. Even if you don't have any idea if you're going to be writing a contract, I just appreciate a little bit of heads up so that I can, kind of plan around that. Because if you don't give me a heads up and just let me know, hey, I've got this offer, I may be doing something else. So, because I do have a life. I know. All right. Well, thank you, Connor. Thank you, everybody that was on Facebook and all of those that are watching it later. Let me know if you have any questions, and I won't see you now for another month. So I'll talk to you in December. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.
Bye.